Hi everyone, good morning and welcome back. And we'll continue our study and discussion on the early church history based on 4 Gospels. But before we actually begin to read the records in the New Testament, for 4 Gospels, we're trying to understand the church and also the history. And this is our 5th week, number 5. And so we are halfway through when we are done with this one, hopefully. And we have discussed in the last week about the functions and the missions of a church or the church. So we'll just have a brief review on this, and then we will go into the part number 2. So we'll just cover the part 1. This is the end of the part 1, lesson number 4. So functions and the missions of a church. It is important to understand what is church is for. Why is the church in the history? And without knowing the reason, the purpose of a church, we will not be able to identify if is church doing a right thing or something else. And many times in the history, church has forgotten, actually not the church itself, but the leaders, the human beings, the so-called Christian leaders in a church or the church or denomination. They somehow had forgotten what the church is existing for. And thus it is important for us to remind again and again what the essence of the church is, the being of the church, and also the doing part of the church. So that has to do with the doing part. So we'll just go over the review. So the basic, the reason is to begin the church, to begin with. The church is primary and the initial and the most fundamental function and the reason and the purpose for its existence is for the salvation of each soul and spirit who is lost because of the sin. The sin has been committed, and then sin they are committing, but the major sin is living without God. Again, the sin, S-I-N, with the singular, and the sin of a human generation, and each individual who are living on earth or born into earth, is that they are born into earth without God. Because their ancestors, the generations prior, they did not know God, and basically human generation is living without God. So the salvation is the primary and the most initial and important purpose of church's function and the reason. And the holiness, once you become, and the reason we are going to be saved is so we want to recover the original image and the likeness that were given to human generation, as it is written in the Genesis chapter 1. And God said in Genesis chapter 1, I believe it's 28, 26, it says, let us make man in our own image and in our likeness. That's how God had designed us to be. And the holiness is recovering that initial image and likeness as God has given us. And it includes goodness, righteousness, clean, pure, and being sanctified. So the cleansing and sanctification is a process of becoming holy. So you don't become holy at once. Even if you believe in Jesus Christ, if you have accepted Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, still we are in this world, and we are in the process of coming out of this world, and that takes the time and effort and your decision and hard work from you, but everything is done because of the Holy Spirit. That's how we believe. So the Holy Spirit is the agent, and he's the leader, and he's the one who initiates and processes this cleansing and sanctification. So the church, any church that if it's a church, should help its people, its members, to become holy by pursuing cleansing and sanctification. And that in the history, and even today, church is doing something else, and they think something else is more important than that attaining and pursuing the holiness. Holiness is the godliness. It is how we become more like God, more like Jesus Christ every day. So that's the concept of holiness. So it is done by confession, renewal, reformation, and regeneration, of course. Regeneration is the part of salvation. Then wholeness. While the holiness is the becoming more like God in terms of the sin and righteousness and so on, wholeness is a process of becoming a person, more complete. I told you that it takes time and effort, and it takes time, it takes a growth. So wholeness is a becoming perfect and complete, and trying to be full. So fullness meaning the image and likeness, you may be just 10%, 20% compared to who God is. So fullness is 100%. We're trying to become 100%, and also there's a being part and a doing part as a godly person, as a holy person, and those are included in the terms of wholeness. And basically, wholeness is Christ-likeness. You become like a Jesus. You try to live like Jesus Christ, who has lived to give us the example, and who worked and ministered to show us what a Christian should do, and then he died and resurrected. So we die and being resurrected every day. We go to sleep and then we wake up. That's the kind of as an example of experiencing this resurrection every day. Then wisdom and maturity is a part of becoming whole. Then lastly, in the function and purpose of the church, I mean, it's not the last, but this is the last in my lesson, lesson 4. The stewards of the world. The church does exist because of the world. See, church has been since its beginning 2,000 plus years ago. It existed within the world. So Jesus said, you are in the world, but not of the world. So that's the key, very key statement, and then principle that Jesus has taught for us, for Christians, and for the church. So we are in the world, but not of the world. See, you don't belong to the world, even though you are in the world. So that's kind of the paradox and the paradigm which we need to sustain. There is a certain not only there is a conflict, there is that a tension, a very tension of the church being in the world. So us as a Christian is have to understand that tension. And within the history, the church tried to ease those tensions, and when that happens, church loses its the reason for existence, and we call that syncretism or secularization. Because we do not belong to the church, the world, the church do not belong to the world, we are separated. I mean, not in this, what is the word? We are different. We are sanctified. But when church becomes more like a world, church tries to imitate the word. Church tries to follow the principles of the world. We call secularization. We call it secularization, meaning we kind of corrupt. So that has happened a lot in the history. And as we study the early church history, we try to see the pattern. I mean, there's a pattern of church becoming more like the world. Instead of church influencing the world, so world becomes more like a church, and more like a kingdom of God. So when a church makes its influence and impact and the change toward the world, then it's the kingdom of God. So that influence, that sovereign and the rule into the church, into the world by the church, that is called evangelization. So either you're going through the secularization or evangelization. And throughout history, this happens simultaneously. I mean, it happens at the same time. And we see that, even with a good church may have some aspect of secularization without even knowing that they are being secularized. And then they do evangelization as well. So this arrow will represent the direction of evangelization there. But another arrow, the word coming into the church, that is called secularization. And in history, and even today, we see this happening. And that's the one major aspect that we are trying to identify and make a change. So evangelization is good, while secularization is not good. And also, not only you evangelize means, this. And in there, there's a social responsibility which the church is obligated simply it means you are responsible because you're a church or the church. You have that responsibility toward the world. See, you cannot avoid this. You cannot say, I'm a church, I'm holy, so I cannot touch or associate or relate to the rotten, sinful, corrupted world. See, that has been some the approach of so-called some fundamentalists. Not all of them, but many of those who are so-called conservative and fundamental Christians, they try to avoid the world because they don't want to be secularized. But the better picture or the proper picture of a church is that you are obligated to the world. You are responsible. And there is something called a social responsibility. There, because the society, you see poverty, you see the sickness, and you see injustice. And these things, you want to correct them. And you want to say, this injustice is injustice. And you want to be involved in the poverty so people can have the better standard of living and the well-being of any human being. Any human being, this is very important. Any, regardless of whether they're Christian or not, whether they are white or black, or Asians, whether they are young or old, whether they are man or woman, or even LGBTQ so-called. I mean, it's, whether they are sinners even. I mean, we are sinners still. The Christians are. So, some Christians make that judgment and disregard certain kind of people from their perspective, which is wrong. I mean, God does not, and He does not separate one kind of human being from the other kind of human being because of the reason of race, gender, or other things, factors. I mean, from God's perspective, every human being are His valuable creation. And every human being are the ones who had sinned against Him. Period. The Christians are the ones who are going to be saved because of the grace of Jesus Christ. Because they trusted in the name of Jesus and name of Christ. That's the only reason that they are going to be saved. But otherwise, our human generation are the equal and the same. Same in the terms of being a sinner, and then and equal in the terms of they are created as a human being who reflects the image and the likeness of God. So any human being, so-called in the world, need to be attended, addressed, and cared for. So that's what we call social responsibility. So when we are doing, a church is doing its ministry, not only you are to evangelize those non-believers, but you are still giving whatever resources that you have, that you are going to share that with the poor and the sick and those who are in need. So that's called the social responsibility. And the justice. I mean, God did not created the world to be unjust, unbalanced. And there are a lot of social sins that is going on in the world. There's social injustice, racial discrimination, and then the poverty is also a part of injustice. So these things need to be corrected, and the church has to continually say these things against the world and say it is unjust. And we see a lot of these things going on, even in America. I mean, which part of the world, it doesn't matter whether it's America, Korea, Japan, China, and India, everywhere there is injustice, because injustice has been with the human history from the beginning. After the fall, after Adam and Eve, there was always this injustice, and it needs to be addressed. And the mission basically is what the church does for the world. So that is called the mission. Not only evangelize, not only do take a social responsibility, not only take the justice, all these things are called the mission of a church. It is obligation and it's mandate. So obligated means you are responsible. You have to do it because you're the church. So if you become a believer, not only your whole church is responsible for all these things, you as an individual believer, as a Christian, is responsible for these. So the history is not only a history of human generation, it is a history of the church and the mission. So that you are being responsible to take the world into your responsibility. So as an individual, you are going through that history as well. So your life, your individual personal life becomes a part of the whole church history. So we need to remember that. Okay? So that kind of covers the lesson 4 of part 2. Let's go to okay. Part 2, understanding history. So we have covered so far about what the church is for, what church needs to do, and as it is designed by God. And now part 2 covers understanding history, because we are talking about church history, and then we'll take a early part as a part number 3. So part 1 dealt with the church. Part 2 is going to deal with the history in general. So understanding history. I'm sure you have studied the subject of history in your early years, from elementary to junior high and high school and so on. And if you have done some college studies, you have also did a study on history. Every grade, I believe, every grade have certain portion of lesson on history. So you have had probably at least 10 years of study on history. But many times, from my own experience, in Korea, when you're doing the study of history, you are to memorize all these, which year and what happened. And it's a list of the things that you want to remember. And you are tested, on your memory part, rather than the focusing on the significance and the trend and context of the history. But if you have studied in the Western world, if you have done studies in Europe or in North America somewhere, the history is quite different subject than that I have known in Korea. So I think many of students from China, you guys probably have a similar experience. But another thing is how you view the history. So that's called a perspective, and we'll deal with that as well. So we'll begin with the lesson 1, concept and definition of history. C. Let's go back to this formula. We are in the world, the reality that is given to us, and then we live certain life, existence, life, or you can call it life or a lifestyle. So you live, you exist. Your existence, your way of life, is determined by this, the blank. And let's say belief or beliefs. So how you perceive the world, the reality, will determine your existence. And this belief or paradigms or perspective is key to human existence. It's the essence. But the problem is, your belief and my belief may be different. or most likely 99.99% will be different. Of course, there is some shared belief. There are some shared belief, but to our surprise, people does not share them much, unless you are Christian, or you are Democrat, or you're socialist, or you are communist. That kind of defines your shared belief. And even though you are Christian, see, Christian itself, I would call a Christian, but I'm an evangelical. And some will say I'm a Christian, I'm a conservative. And some will say I'm a Christian and I'm a Methodist, or I'm a Baptist, or I'm a Presbyterian, or I'm a Catholic. And while some will say I'm a Protestant. So even within some of the shared belief, there are those differences. And because of these differences, the concepts and the definition of history will be different from one person to the other, one scholar to the other scholars. So the very problem that we are facing when we are doing a history, whether it's just a secular history or Christian history or church history, there is this problem of the concepts and definition. So I'm not going to present this is the right concept or the right definition of a church or of history. I could say this is the right definition of a church according to the Bible. But when it comes to history, it's a little different. But so there is a biblical and Christian view on history compared to that is not so Christian. And I'll try to present the terms and definition of history, and you are to decide. You may have your own perspective on history already, because you're all grown up person. And when you are 20 or over as an adult, you must have certain perspective and concept and definition on history. So this class, the lesson that we are kind of discussing together may change your perspective, definition, and concepts. But I'm not, forcing you to change, but you wait or you evaluate or to take a look at your own perspective on history and compare to what I'm trying to present. So this is the kind of lesson that we are going to cover, and at this second half of week number 5. So it begins lesson. Dictionary definition. This is how the English dictionaries, the popular dictionaries with some authorities will define history. Okay. So before we go into actual definition, why don't we take a short break and come back for this discussion. Okay, we are back and we'll continue our lesson on the perspective definition and the concept on history. So to begin with, let's look at this dictionary definition according to this Merriam-Webster, which is quite a authority on the definition of concepts in English words. It says, according to Merriam-Webster, a chronological record of significant events such as those affecting a nation or institution, often including an explanation of their causes. So the element is chronological, following the dates as the time advances. And it has to be significant events. So you do not include everything in the history. It has to be something significant, such as, it's just an example, affecting a nation, or the institution, or individuals. So generally, history that we are reading or studying would affect many people instead of just one individual. So then this is a narrative, but it says this is important because it affects, changes life or the existence of many. The many will depend on who is writing for, but it's many, usually millions and millions. And it includes explanation of their cause, and also explanation of how it affected later on to the world or to the people. So explanation is another key. Again, that explanation is so-called interpretation. So the very tricky part of history is the interpretation, how you interpret it, and who is interpreting those events, and the cause. How do you determine this is the cause and that is not the cause, and which is the most important cause and which is not so important? So it's an interpretation. There's no simple neutral explanation. That does not happen, and there's no objective perspective on history. That never happens. So when we are talking about history, it's all interpretation, your perspective, who's writing it, how you write it. That is all part of interpretation. That's why it is really difficult to have a good history. So good history is not the way, the perspective and interpretation, rather it is how well organized and how is it reasonable. So your interpretation needs to be rational, reasonable, and based on the facts. We call that historical facts. But the thing is, without record or records, it is difficult to find the facts. But even these so-called record or documentation or evidences of proof are subject to interpretation. those who are writing this record about the history, they do have their own interpretation put into that record. So the facts are not so facts after all. So that's how difficult it is to do history. Second definition says, a branch of knowledge that records and explains past events. Past events. So history always usually deals with the past, but history also deals with the future. By how you interpret and understand the history, the past events, it's gonna affect, influence your decision for the today toward the future. So the history is not just the past for me, but it is present and future. Because how you view the past events will definitely it will influence your decision for the day today. And because of that decision, you are going to change your existence of the future or future existence. That's how the history works. So as a church, how you view the past events or past narrative of a church will determine how you make decisions as a church today, and that's gonna make a very different picture of the church for the tomorrow. So that's how it is. So that's what the church history is for. And then it also involves the interpretation. I told you that there are many denominations and then different beliefs. Even with the shared belief, there are many differences among the Christians even. And because of that differences, the interpretation is going to be different. Sometimes totally different. So that's the definition. Another definition from Oxford Dictionary. That's usually the European English speaking world uses this Oxford. It says the study of past events. Okay, again the past events, particular in human affairs. Particularly in human affairs. And particularly in church affairs. So church history, or to say the study of past events, particularly in church affairs. That's what the church history is going to be, according to that definition. And then second definition says the whole series of past events connected with the someone or something. So the key here is connected. There are many different ways of being connected. It could be influence, it could be negative, it could be positive, it could be very closely connected or loosely connected. The very different ways of connection, and also has to do with the interpretation of it. And it is someone or something. So that's how that someone is going to be you for the church history, and the something will be the church structures, church system, church organization, or what the church is doing, and so on. So you can apply that definition to the church history, and you can define what the church history is. So we kind of get the idea. It has to do with the past and past events, and then how it relates to you today. And it does deal with the human affairs, the events, and the episodes, and so on. Now, that has been the dictionary definition of history. Now let's try to get some of the perspectives from the so-called historians or scholars in history. These historians are the ones who deal with the history. They are the ones who is making living about history. This is he or she is the member of this particular branch of knowledge or academic field, in another word. So there's the vast field called academic field or branch of knowledge called history. And if you are a student, or if you're a teacher, or if you're an expert on history, you are called a historian. So historians there are many thousands and thousands of historians, and some are famous and some are not. But these are some of the people. Some are not historian, but they still have something to say about the definition of history or concept of history. Okay, let's begin with this one. This one is from internet. The reason I just quoted the so-called the internet definition is because this is how the general public so-called amateur historians would perceive what the history is. It says the body of knowledge about the past produced by historians together with everything that is involved in the production, communication of, and teaching about that knowledge. So, study of history. It includes the story of history, and it is basically done by so-called historian. I just defined who these historians are. So that's how the general people perceive history. From non-historians' perspective, this is how the history is defined. Again, another definition from the internet. Internet is good because it presents vast opinions of just all kinds of different people, while it is not so sometimes it's not so accurate. So accuracy and popularity. Accuracy is usually the matter with the so-called internet information, but as you look into the internet, you'll find how just general public will perceive on certain topic or certain events and episodes and so on. The attempt made by professional historians to record and reconstruct the past through the study of evidence derived from a variety of resources. So again, records and facts. It says evidence, and then variety of sources. Sources including records and artifacts, archaeological findings, and so on. You include that in so-called evidences. And looking at the evidences, it says derived from as again interpretation. It takes a certain interpretation, even if you try to deal with the just simple facts, pure facts. Still, once you say it about the facts, it becomes interpretation. So there's no way that you can avoid interpretation in history. Because of this belief. Everyone does not share the same belief. That's never the case. You and I, even among your family, you have different beliefs. So that's what causes different interpretation, and this different interpretation does matter many times because it causes conflicts. It brings out the conflicts, and even some will kill another human being for the reason of difference in interpretation, because it has to do with the belief, and belief many times is stronger than any other things. Not even blood. Family is related by blood, but many times it's stronger than that. We see that. So becoming a Christian is a very dangerous thing. Very dangerous thing for most of people. Not just for the people in the Muslim world, but not just people who live in China or North Korea. In North Korea, you cannot say that you are a Christian. Even though they have so-called government church or authorized church, that's just it's a fake. I could say that's a fake. And there's a true church, underground church, and that underground church represents how dangerous it is for North Korean to become a Christian. So you can be killed for your own belief. Again, coming back to the definition. So you look at the evidence, but how you study the evidence will bring out the different interpretation. And according to this definition, it even goes further. It says professional historians. The historians who are doing it for the living, they're the ones who have the authority, because they are doing it for the living. That means they are the ones who have certain authorities, a certain level of knowledge and expertise, and that's how we define history. But for us, history is a narrative for everyone to understand and study. You don't have to be a historian because you're studying a church history. If you're a Christian, you're a believer, and you are obligated, again, where is the word? Okay, obligated. It is your responsibility, your mandate, your duty to study the history of church. You don't have to be a professional historian. You become a historian once you become a Christian. Okay. E.H. Carr, this is one of the famous modern historians. Many will quote his definition when trying to define history. In his book, What is History? Very simple question, but very difficult question to answer. What is history? E.H. Carr writes this: history is a continuous process of interaction between the historian and his facts, an unending dialogue between the present and the past. See, there are two major key subjects in here. One is between historian and his facts, and then the other part is dialogue between the present and the past. So again, between historian and the facts, then he finds here there's something called interpretation. So it's process of interpretation, continuing process of interpretation. Interaction, another word is interpretation. And then a dialogue between the present and the past. See, that's what the history is. I totally agree with this very neutral definition of what the history is, or what the study of history is. So when we are doing a history, so this is what it is. Okay, another famous historian, John Jacob Anderson. He says, he's a historian, very scholastic, professional historian, says history is a narration of the events. He says not just events, the events which put importance. There are certain events that are important again and that influences many people, right? Which have happened among mankind, including an account of the rise and the fall of nations, as well as of other great changes which have affected the political and social condition of the human race. So not only political and social, I would say all dimensions of human condition. But usually when a historian writes a history, their accounts are exclusive, not inclusive, but exclusive to those political and social, because that is something that changes. But I would to add financial as well, because today in modern 21st century and even 20th century that we just went over, the financial or economical condition would be one major key factor in history. So I would say all key dimension of human race. But if you just need to add one to the political and social, I would add economical. And it says fall of nation, rise of a nation. That's usually what the history is looking at. So if you apply that definition to the church history, the fall of church and rise of church, because church has been in that roller coaster ride, up and down and up and down. So that means any history, whatever you write, whether it's about the nation, whether it is about certain tribal people, or whether it's a church or business, whatever you are writing the history about or trying to study the history about, it has rise and fall. And the history looks at why did it rise and why did it fall. That's going to be the one key perspective and the point of concern when you are doing a history. W.C. Saller and Yitzman. Okay, these are also the famous historians, modern day historians. They say history is not what you thought; it is what you remember. All other history defeats itself. So some of the history is forgotten, and then it's not what you thought that matters, but it's what you remember by the record. So people document what is happening today. See, just for example, today, for the pandemic, I'm recording this lesson on the 27th of April as of today, look at the pandemic. You don't write everything that's happening in every corner of the world, but the pandemic in India becomes a news. And historians is going to write about the India and the COVID-19 in India in the early 2021, April and May. We don't know what's going to happen in the May, but the historian's going to write about it, because it is what they want to remember, because it's a big thing. It influences many people. Body of is it 1,000 million people? Yeah. 1 billion people, 1 billion, right? So 1 billion people plus, right? So that's going to affect many in that part of the world. And the history is going to remember that and write about it. Even the journalist also is become their part of the history. They are also historians, because they are making these records as of what is happening today. Even though they include some interpretation, they still write the record and it becomes facts. How many new patients happen every day. So that's going to be facts, but there's going to be following the interpretation. R.O. Toynbee, also very famous historian in early 20th century, right? And he writes, history not used to is nothing, for all intellectual life is action, like practical life, and if you don't use the stuff well, it might as well be dead. So history need to be used, need to be utilized. It should give lesson to who you are, what you do, and how you decide for your present and the future. So that's basically what it means, what he's trying to say. Toynbee says, history is meaningful and useful when you use it. For the church history, again, you study early church history. The reason that we do is because we want to use it, utilize it, and you use it well, not against it, but for the better or improvement or advance of the church. So that's what the church history is going to be. Charles Austin Bird, this is a famous historian, says, the creator of it would possess the attributes ascribed by the theologians to God. The future once revealed, humanity would have nothing to do except to wait its doom. What he's trying to say here is, history is something that are past. And I believe this is a Christian historian, and he says that the reason he says this is how we read God's doing. And history cannot tell you about the future, but one thing that the history tells about the future is we are facing the doom. That's how the Bible projects the history going to be. But the thing is, we do not know exactly what's going to happen and how it happened. But we know the end for Christians. But non-believers, they do not project the future to be that dark. So that's the main difference between the Christian and non-Christians. They see the end differently. And the church, what do you do when the world is going to be end with the doom? Doom means the very dark end, the judgment. Everything's going to fall. That's what the doom is. Okay, Martin Luther King Jr. You know who he is. The black pastor, Christian pastor, who has been assassinated for the civil movement. And still today we have to see the Black Lives Matter movement. Because still blacks in this country, Asians in this country, even though they were born here, and the blacks, they have been here in America for 300 plus years, still they're struggling to fight against injustice because of just the color of skin. Under the color of skin, everything's the same. You have the same red blood and the same pinkish flesh. You eat the same food and produce same poop. And people make very big differences because of the skin color. Because you're Asian and your eyes are small, that doesn't mean that you're less human than any other kind of the different race. So that's something that we are fighting against. Whether you're Christian or non-Christian, still that's a Christian value. That's what the Bible taught us, and we need to fight against it. And then he said, Martin Luther King Jr., the major lesson of history. There are four. First, whom the gods destroy, they first make mad with power. Second, the mills of God grind slowly, but they grind exceedingly small. Third, the bee fertilizes the flower it robs. Fourth, when it is dark enough, you can see the stars. See, this is very figurative, poetic, and that's difficult to understand at first reading and glance. You need to meditate on this. But basically what it's trying to say is history is a struggle for the weak and the powerless. Because he is one of those who's been persecuted, who's been oppressed, and was born as a black in a very, very poor community. And he is fighting with the people who are sharing the same reality. Because of the common shared reality, they would have had the same shared belief. Because they can relate with their own experiences. And that's how they perceived the reality, and they are the ones who got together to make a better existence. And the thing is, there are those forces and the power and people who are trying to degrade or put down someone else's existence. So when that happens, you are on the fighting mode. So look at the number 4. When it is dark enough, you can see the stars. That's kind of paradox of human history. When it is darkest, the little light shines brighter. And he says the hope that we find in God, because he mentions God, that's something that we are looking at. And how did the old days, for example, Columbus from Spain, Portugal, how did he travel to America? By looking at the stars at night. That's the very better clue than the sun. So in the dark, you find the ways. That's what he is saying. And then this is from the deaths of evil upon the seashore. So we will conclude our class today with this very meaningful and deeply thought understanding on the history. As how Martin Luther King interprets the history. And we do have our own interpretation about history, and we will try to share that perspectives and the thoughts about the church as it begins in the 4 Gospels. That's what we are going to trying to do and in the coming lessons. But for today, let's say this is the lesson for today, and thank you for your attention. I'll come back next week and see you again. Bye.